The 911 call from 47 Summer Street began not with a scream, but with a husband's heavy, panicked breathing. Patrick Clancy had been gone for exactly 20 minutes, just enough time to pick up a stool softener from CVS and a Mediterranean power bowl. He returned to a house that had been hollowed out. His wife, Lindsay, was lying on the frozen turf after a 3-story plunge from their bedroom window, her back broken. But she was the lucky one. In the basement, their 3 children, 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 7-month-old Callan, were still tethered to the exercise bands their mother had used to end their lives. This wasn't just a crime, it was a total silent collapse of the suburban dream. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the magnitude of what collapsed on Summer Street, one has to look at the foundation. And in Duxbury, Massachusetts, foundations are built on a very specific kind of coastal upper-middle-class perfection. This is a town defined by its quietude, a place of historic Cape Cod-style homes, salt marshes, and a community that prides itself on being a safe harbor. It is the kind of neighborhood where the sound of a siren is an anomaly, something that belongs to a different world. At the center of this idyllic setting was the Clancy family. 32-year-old Lindsay Clancy didn't just live in this world. She was, by all outward appearances, its most successful inhabitant. Lindsay was a woman who had dedicated her professional life to the most delicate of transitions, the arrival of new life. As a labor and delivery nurse at the prestigious Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, she was the person families leaned on during their most vulnerable moments. Her colleagues described her as a shining light within the maternity ward, a woman possessed of a natural, grounded empathy that made her exceptionally good at a high-pressure job. There is a cruel, haunting irony in her vocation. A woman who spent 12-hour shifts ensuring infants safely entered the world was the same woman who would eventually be accused of ushering her own children out of it. The lifestyle the Clancys maintained was the digital embodiment of the American dream. If you scrolled through Lindsay's social media or looked at the family's Christmas cards, you saw a curated gallery of happiness. There were photos of trips to the White Mountains, smiling children in matching pajamas, and a home that looked like it had been lifted from the pages of a design magazine. Patrick Clancy, her husband, was the steady anchor to her professional ambition. He worked in sales for a tech company, a role that allowed them to afford the gray shingled house on Summer Street and the private, comfortable life that came with it. They were the couple people looked at when they wanted to know what having it all looked like. Then there were the children, the 3 vibrant lives that defined the Clancy's world. 5-year-old Cora was the eldest, a girl remembered for her nurturing spirit and the way she shadowed her mother, wanting to be just like the nurse who helped people. 3-year-old Dawson was the middle child, a burst of toddler energy who was often seen playing in the yard, his laughter a constant soundtrack to the neighborhood. And finally, there was Callan, the 7-month-old baby who had only just begun to develop a personality of his own. To the neighbors, they were just another young family navigating the beautiful chaos of 3 children under the age of 6. But beneath this veneer of porcelain perfection, a different story was being written in the margins. The transition after Callan's birth in 2022 hadn't been like the others. For Lindsay, the return to work and the demands of 3 young children began to weigh differently this time. In the tight-knit circles of Duxbury, people noticed that Lindsay seemed more tired, perhaps a bit more withdrawn. But in the world of perfect parenting, these signs are often dismissed as the standard fatigue of a working mother. Friends told investigators later that Lindsay was open about her struggles with anxiety. It wasn't a secret, but it was handled with the same clinical efficiency she applied to her job. She sought help. She went to the experts. She did everything the perfect mother is supposed to do when the walls start closing in. What no one realized was that the very empathy that made her a great nurse was beginning to turn inward, curdling into a toxic, obsessive worry. The medical community she was a part of was about to become her only world, but not as a healer, as a patient. The idealized nurse was slowly being replaced by a woman who was drowning in plain sight, standing in a beautiful kitchen on a quiet street, surrounded by everything she had ever wanted. The tragedy of Lindsay Clancy isn't just what happened in that 20-minute window in January. It's the slow, silent erosion of a woman who was once the person everyone else turned to for strength, until she had none left for herself. The descent did not begin with a crash. It began with a whisper, a subtle shift in the internal weather of Lindsay Clancy's mind following the birth of her son, Callan, in May 2022. For a woman who had navigated the births of 2 previous children with the steady hand of a professional, this third postpartum period felt fundamentally different. The baby blues, that common, transient fog of exhaustion, didn't lift as the weeks turned into months. Instead, it solidified into something much more opaque and much more dangerous. By the autumn of 2022, the woman who had once been the primary source of comfort for laboring mothers in Boston found herself unable to self-soothe. She was a nurse who knew all the clinical signs of postpartum depression, yet she was becoming a prisoner to them. She was remarkably candid with those around her, including her husband, Patrick. She didn't hide in the shadows, she stood in the light and asked for help. This is perhaps the most tragic element of the Clancy narrative, the sheer volume of medical intervention that preceded the tragedy. Lindsay sought out the best care Massachusetts had to offer. She consulted with psychiatrists, she attended therapy, and eventually she enrolled in a partial hospitalization program at McLean Hospital, a facility world-renowned for its psychiatric care. To her friends and family, it appeared that Lindsay was doing the work. She was checking the boxes, following the protocols, and fighting for her stability. But inside the quiet rooms of the Summer Street home, the anxiety was no longer a feeling. It was an atmospheric pressure that never let up. During this period, the medical approach to her deteriorating state became a revolving door of pharmacology. Over the span of just 4 months, Lindsay was prescribed a dizzying array of medications, a cocktail, that would later become a central pillar of her legal defense. The list read like a manual of modern psychiatry: Zoloft, Lexapro, Prozac, Klonopin, Valium, Seroquel, amitriptyline, Trazodone, Ativan, and others. It was a relentless cycle of trial and error. She would start one pill, wait for the side effects to settle, only to find that the underlying dread remained untouched, leading her doctors to layer on another or switch her to something more potent. She told her husband and her clinicians that she felt like a zombie, numb, disconnected, and increasingly depersonalized. She described a sensation of being flattened by the very drugs intended to save her. Despite the mounting dosage, the cracks were widening. She became obsessed with her children's health and safety, yet she felt a growing, terrifying distance from them. This is the hallmark of the cruelest forms of postpartum illness: the obsessive-compulsive need to be a perfect protector, paired with intrusive, horrific thoughts of harm. She was trapped in a feedback loop of maternal guilt and clinical failure. By December, her journals, later used by investigators, detailed a woman who was desperately trying to find her way back to herself. She wrote about her love for her children, her gratitude for Patrick, and her utter confusion as to why her brain was refusing to cooperate. She was working out. She was trying to eat well. She was attending every appointment. And yet, the light in her eyes was being systematically extinguished by a profound chemical darkness. Patrick would later tell investigators that he saw his wife struggling, but he believed the medical professionals were in control. He was a man who trusted the system, and as long as they were adjusting her meds and seeing her for therapy, he believed they were on the path to a new normal. The transition into January 2023 was marked by a chilling paradox. To the outside world, Lindsay seemed to be improving. She was more active on social media. She was taking the kids to playdates, and she was preparing to return to work at MGH. But this functional appearance was a mask that was becoming too heavy to wear. Behind closed doors, the intrusive thoughts were no longer whispers. They were becoming commands. She began to hear voices, a symptom of postpartum psychosis that is often kept secret by the sufferer out of a paralyzing fear of being deemed unfit. She reportedly told a psychiatrist that a voice had instructed her to kill the children and herself. Yet, shortly after, she was cleared and told that she was not a danger to herself or others. This clinical miscalculation would have catastrophic consequences. In the days leading up to January 24th, Lindsay was in a state of high-functioning agitation. She was meticulously planning the mundane details of her family's life, what they would eat, when they would sleep, while her internal world was a theater of war. The medications, rather than acting as a bridge to safety, seemed to have created a fog through which she could no longer see the shore. She was a labor and delivery nurse who understood the biology of life, but she was now being governed by a biology of despair. The porcelain image of the Duxbury mother was still intact on the surface, but the structural integrity of her mind had vanished. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the only people who could have pulled her back were the ones who believed she was finally getting better. The tragedy was not born of a lack of love, but of a lack of clarity. As the sun set over the marshes of Duxbury in those final days of January, the house on Summer Street was filled with the sounds of 3 young children and the quiet, desperate prayers of a mother who was losing her grip on reality. The cocktail of pills sat on the nightstand, a testament to a medical effort that had somehow missed the mark, and the 20-minute window that would change everything was rapidly approaching. January 24th, 2023 began as an unremarkable Tuesday in the South Shore. One of those gray, damp New England winter days where the light seems to retreat by mid-afternoon. For the Clancy family, the morning was filled with the rhythmic mundanity of suburban life. Patrick was working from his home office, while Lindsay was engaged with the children. There was no outward sign of a looming storm. No raised voices, no shattered glass, no erratic behavior that would have signaled to a husband that his wife was on the precipice of a total psychological break. In fact, Lindsay had spent part of the morning playing in the snow with 5-year-old Cora and 3-year-old Dawson. She even texted a friend about a playdate, her tone seemingly light, her focus on the future. But as the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere inside the home began to shift, invisible to Patrick, but captured in the digital footprints Lindsay left behind. Around 4 p.m., she began a series of calculated searches on her phone. She wasn't searching for help or looking for a crisis hotline. She was looking at logistics. She checked the wait times at a local restaurant called 3V in Plymouth. She looked up the inventory at a CVS nearby. She was timing the world outside her door. Investigators would later point to this as evidence of a lucid mind, a woman carving out a specific isolated pocket of time. At 4:53 p.m., Lindsay sent a text to Patrick, asking if he would mind running out to pick up dinner and some medicine for the children. Specifically, she requested a stool softener, Miralax, and a Mediterranean power bowl from 3V. To Patrick, this was a standard request, a small act of service to help his wife manage the evening rush. He didn't hesitate. He looked at his wife, saw the same woman he had shared a life with for years, and prepared to leave. He later told investigators that there was nothing in her eyes or her voice that suggested the woman standing in the kitchen was a stranger. Patrick pulled out of the driveway at 5:33 p.m. The window was officially open. For the next 36 minutes, the house on Summer Street became a place of unthinkable, silent industry. Based on the medical examiner's reports and the reconstruction of the scene, the sequence of events was as precise as it was horrific. Lindsay didn't simply snap. She moved through the house with a terrifying, goal-oriented focus. She led the 3 children down into the finished basement, a space usually reserved for toys, laughter, and the chaotic joy of 3 siblings. In the basement, she used blue exercise bands, the kind found in any suburban home gym, to fashion ligatures. She began with Cora, the 5-year-old who looked up to her, then Dawson, finally 7-month-old Callan. There was no struggle reported, no evidence of a frantic fight for survival. There was only the heavy clinical silence of the basement. The prosecution would later argue that it takes several minutes of sustained pressure to end a life in this manner. A detail that suggests she didn't just act in a moment of impulse, but remained committed to the act as the minutes ticked by. 3 children, one after another. While this was happening, Patrick was at CVS. He called Lindsay at 5:37 p.m. to confirm the specific brand of medicine she wanted. She answered. Her voice was steady, her instructions clear. She sounded, in his words, completely normal. She was in the middle of a triple homicide, yet she maintained the vocal cadence of a nurse discussing a prescription. This is the detail that haunts the case. the ability to toggle between the mundane and the monstrous without a tremor in her tone. By 5:54 p.m., Patrick was at the restaurant picking up the takeout. He sent a text letting her know he was on his way back. There was no reply. At 6:09 p.m., Patrick's car pulled back into the driveway. He had been gone for exactly 36 minutes. He walked through the front door, expecting the usual evening noise, the television, the pitter-patter of feet, the smell of home. Instead, he was met with a silence so profound it felt physical. He called out for Lindsay. No answer. He moved through the first floor, the bags of food still in his hands. He climbed the stairs to their second-floor bedroom. The door was locked. When he finally forced his way in, the room was empty, but the window was wide open, the screen pushed out into the night air. He looked down. In the dim light of the backyard, he saw his wife's body crumpled on the frozen ground. She had jumped from the third story, a 20-foot plunge intended to end her own life. Patrick sprinted down the stairs and out into the yard. He found Lindsay conscious, but her body was broken. She had survived the fall, but she was paralyzed. In those frantic seconds, his only thought was for his wife, until he asked her the question that every parent would ask. He asked where the children were. She looked at him and, with a chillingly flat affect, told him they were in the basement. Patrick ran back into the house, his heart hammering against his ribs. He descended the basement stairs, moving into the darkness. What he found there was a scene that first responders would later describe as a war zone of the soul. His children were lying on the floor, the exercise bands still tightened around their necks. He began to scream. He began to pull at the ligatures, his hands trembling as he tried to reverse the irreversible. He called 911 at 6:11 p.m. The dispatcher heard a man in the throes of total psychological collapse. Patrick was sobbing, begging for help, performing CPR on bodies that were already cooling. He stayed on the line as the sirens began to wail in the distance, a sound that finally broke the silence of Summer Street. The 20-minute window had closed, and in its wake, an entire family had been erased. The precision of the timing, the phone call at CVS, the menu checks, the deliberate choice of a moment when Patrick would be far enough away to be helpless, created a timeline that was both a medical tragedy and a criminal blueprint. As the EMTs rushed into the basement, they found a father who had been gone for a meal and returned to a mausoleum. The gray New England winter had finally claimed the house on Summer Street, turning the perfect home into a crime scene that would be studied for years to come. The first sirens to pierce the Duxbury air that evening didn't sound like a rescue mission. They sounded like a rupture. In a town where police logs usually consist of minor traffic infractions or wandering pets, the frantic dispatch at 6:11 p.m. signaled a catastrophe that the local force was physically and emotionally unprepared for. The first officer on the scene found the gray house illuminated by the rhythmic, cold flash of blue and red lights, a stark contrast to the warm, yellow glow of the interior lamps. As he stepped onto the lawn, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke was replaced by the clinical urgency of a crisis. In the backyard, a small group of responders gathered around the figure of Lindsay Clancy. She lay on the frozen turf, her body unnervingly still. The officers noted that while her physical injuries were catastrophic, a broken back and a fractured neck, her emotional state was even more alarming. She was conscious, her eyes open, but she seemed to be drifting in a state of profound, hollow detachment. There were no screams of agony, no frantic explanations, only a flat, terrifyingly calm compliance. She spoke in short, clipped sentences, confirming that she had jumped and that the children were downstairs. One responder later remarked that it was as if she were a spectator to her own tragedy, a woman who had already exited the room of her own life before her body ever hit the ground. While the medical team stabilized Lindsay in the yard, a second wave of officers entered the home. They were met by Patrick Clancy, a man who had transitioned from a suburban father to a hollowed-out shell in the span of a single phone call. He was pacing, his hands stained with the evidence of his desperate, failed attempts to save his family. He led them toward the basement, a journey that several veteran officers would later describe as the longest walk of their careers. As they descended the stairs, the mundane trappings of family life, the discarded sneakers, the vibrant plastic toys, the lingering scent of laundry detergent, became a cruel backdrop to the horror waiting at the bottom. The scene in the basement was a silent, geometric nightmare. The children were positioned with a chilling, clinical precision that spoke to a mind governed by a dark, distorted sense of order. The exercise bands, blue, elastic, and entirely ordinary, were still in place. For the paramedics, the professional mask began to slip. They were used to blood, to car accidents, to the messy violence of the world. But they were not used to this. They found 5-year-old Cora and 3-year-old Dawson first. The responders fell into a frantic, rhythmic trance of chest compressions and rescue breaths, their boots squeaking on the basement floor as they fought against a clock that had already stopped. The air in the room was thick with the sound of radios crackling and the heavy, synchronized breathing of men and women trying to perform a miracle. They worked on Callan, the 7-month-old, with a specialized, tender desperation. Because of his age, the intervention was even more delicate. A tiny body surrounded by the massive, gloved hands of EMTs. The decision was made to scoop and run, a tactical retreat to the ambulances where more advanced life support could be administered. The neighborhood watched from behind drawn curtains as 3 small stretchers were rushed out of the house in a blur of white sheets and silver railings. The logistical burden was immense. Duxbury's resources were stretched to their breaking point. Cora and Dawson were rushed to South Shore Hospital in Weymouth, while Callan was eventually airlifted to Boston Children's Hospital, the flight crew working on him mid-air as the helicopter soared over the dark Massachusetts coastline. Back at 47 Summer Street, the rescue mission began to solidify into an investigation. The frantic energy of the EMTs was replaced by the slow, methodical movements of the crime scene technicians. They photographed the exercise bands. They bagged the discarded takeout containers. They stood in the basement and looked at the toys that would never be played with again. For the first responders, the burden was only beginning. Duxbury is a small town. Many of the police officers and firefighters on the scene that night had children who attended the same schools as Cora. Some recognized the Clancy name from the hospital where Lindsay worked. The professional distance required for the job was impossible to maintain. In the days following the event, the Duxbury Fire Department would take the rare step of bringing in a specialized peer support team to help the crew process the moral injury of the basement. They spoke of the haunting contrast between the domesticity of the home and the violence of the act. As the night wore on, the news filtered back from the hospitals. Cora and Dawson were gone. They had been pronounced dead shortly after arrival, their little hearts unable to overcome the sustained pressure of the ligatures. Only Callan remained, tethered to machines in Boston, a fragile, final thread of the Clancy family. The house was eventually cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent monument to a 20-minute window that had decimated an entire lineage. The responders who left the scene that night didn't go home to sleep. They went home to watch their own children sleep, haunted by the image of the blue exercise bands and the flat, silent gaze of the nurse who had once been a savior of the maternity ward. The burden of Summer Street wasn't just in what they saw. It was in the realization that the most dangerous place in the world for those children had been the one place they were supposed to be safe. The state's narrative was clinical and unyielding. They pointed to the fact that she had checked the restaurant's wait time and had texted her husband with a steady hand while the children were, according to their timeline, already in the basement. They argued that the use of exercise bands required a specific, sustained physical effort, a commitment to the act that lasted several minutes per child. To the prosecution, this wasn't a medical failure. It was a triple homicide executed with a nurse's precision. They contended that her mental health struggles, while real, did not reach the legal threshold of insanity. They saw a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and, more importantly, knew that what she was doing was wrong. However, the defense, led by attorney Kevin Reddington, presented a radically different map of the same territory. He described the case not as a criminal act, but as a pharmaceutical tragedy. Reddington began to release the details of the cocktail Lindsay had been prescribed in the months leading up to January 2023. The list was staggering, a rotating cycle of nearly a dozen different psychiatric medications including Zoloft, Lexapro, Prozac, Klonopin, Valium, Seroquel, amitriptyline, trazodone, and ativan. He argued that Lindsay was a victim of involuntary intoxication, a state where the sheer volume and combination of mind-altering drugs had induced a toxic psychosis. He claimed that the medical system hadn't just failed her, it had actively dismantled her grip on reality. The defense focused heavily on her time at McLean Hospital and the partial hospitalization she had undergone just weeks before. They revealed that Lindsay had admitted to medical professionals that she was experiencing suicidal and homicidal ideations. The core of their argument was that she had done everything right. She had sought help, she had been honest about her darkest thoughts, and she had taken every pill she was told to take. Yet, despite these red flags, she was sent home to a house with 3 young children. Reddington argued that the lucidity the prosecution saw in her phone searches was actually the high-functioning autopilot of a woman who was already mentally gone. In February 2023, the world watched as Lindsay Clancy was arraigned via Zoom from her hospital bed at Brigham and Women's Hospital. The visual was jarring. A woman once known for her vibrant health and athletic lifestyle was now pinned to a hospital mattress, her neck encased in a rigid brace. She was paralyzed from the waist down, the result of the T8 spinal cord injury she sustained during her plunge from the window. She sat in silence as the charges were read. 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of strangulation. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She looked like a woman who was still trying to understand how she had arrived at the end of her own story. The psychological evaluations became the new battleground. Experts in postpartum psychosis, a rare and devastating condition affecting roughly 1 or 2 out of every 1,000 new mothers, began to weigh in on the national stage. They explained that psychosis is fundamentally different from depression. It involves a total break from reality, often characterized by command hallucinations, where voices tell the sufferer that they must save their children by ending their lives. The defense argued that Lindsay believed she was acting out of a distorted, psychotic form of love, that she was protecting her children from a world she could no longer navigate. Perhaps the most unexpected element of the trial of the mind was the voice of the man who had lost the most. Just days after the funeral for Cora, Dawson, and Callan, Patrick Clancy released a statement that stunned the community of Duxbury and the world beyond. He did not ask for vengeance. He did not condemn his wife. Instead, he wrote an open letter pleading for the public to forgive Lindsay, as he had. He described her as a woman who was a victim of her own mind, stating that the woman who acted on January 24th was not the Lindsay he knew and loved. He described her real self as a selfless, loving mother, and he urged people to look at her with compassion rather than hate. His forgiveness didn't stop the legal machinery, but it shifted the emotional weight of the case. It forced the public to confront the possibility that 2 things could be true at once, that a horrific, inexcusable act had occurred, and that the person responsible was a woman who had been hollowed out by a medical crisis. The investigation into her medical records continued to reveal a pattern of desperate searching. Lindsay had reached out to dozens of clinicians, joined support groups for postpartum anxiety, and meticulously tracked her own symptoms in her journals. The trial of the mind became a referendum on how we treat maternal mental health and the limitations of a psychiatric system that relies so heavily on trial and error pharmacology. As Lindsay remained in the hospital and later moved to a state-run psychiatric facility, the legal proceedings slowed to a crawl. The debate over her competency and her state of mind on that Tuesday evening remained unresolved. Was she a cold, calculating killer who used her nursing knowledge to finish her family? Or was she a woman who had been chemically pushed off a cliff? The answer lay somewhere in the digital logs of her phone and the microscopic traces of the meds in her blood, a modern suburban tragedy that defied simple categorization. The legal machinery has ground to a halt, caught between the gravity of the charges and the physical reality of the defendant. Lindsay Clancy remains in a state of suspended animation, held in secure medical facilities rather than a prison cell. She is paralyzed from the waist down, a permanent reminder of her leap, which complicates every aspect of the judicial process. How do you prosecute a woman for 3 counts of first-degree murder when she cannot even stand to face the bench? She has been moved from rehab centers to the Lemuel Shattuck Hospital, a state-run facility for those requiring psychiatric oversight and intensive medical care. The court battles now revolve around the question of competency. Each hearing is a grueling exercise in clinical bureaucracy, weighing her brain's capacity to understand the law against the chemical and emotional fog that still lingers. There is no trial date, no finality, only a series of continuances. Lindsay is a prisoner of her own body, waiting for a justice system that doesn't quite know where to house a woman whose life ended long before her heart stopped beating. The house on Summer Street stands as a silent monument to a failure no one saw coming. The nursery is still, the toys frozen in a January evening that never ended. Beyond the yellow tape, the Clancy name has become a catalyst, a painful national dialogue regarding the invisible war of postpartum psychosis. It is a haunting reminder that even the most perfect lives are fragile, and that the strongest anchors can be swept away by a chemical tide. In Duxbury, there are no winners and no simple endings, only the lingering echo of three young voices silenced in a short, tragic window. Lindsay Clancy remains a ghost in her own broken skin, a woman whose professional life was dedicated to the beginning of existence, but whose legacy is now inextricably linked to its end. The gray shingles remain, but the light has long since gone out, leaving only a town and a husband searching for answers in a silence that refuses to speak. A silence that serves as the final, heavy word on a suburban dream turned to ash. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.